Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a world that might feel almost alien to us now, yet was the very normal life for millions of people not so long ago. Let's settle in, dim the lights, and let our minds wander gently into the quiet, often uncomfortable realities of medieval existence. Picture a day in a medieval village or town. The sun is rising over uneven rooftops. Streets are narrow, bustling with activity, and often fragrant in ways we might politely avoid today. People stretch, rise from their simple beds, and begin the daily work that their bodies will endure with remarkable persistence, because, of course, they had little choice. The first thing to notice is the body itself. In the Middle Ages, the human form was constantly tested. Hunger was a companion, more reliable than any friend. Illness was a shadow, and physical discomfort was accepted as part of life. Nobility might have had access to richer food, softer beds, and warm clothes, but their bodies too were fragile. Everyone, whether peasant or prince, understood that survival demanded patience, endurance, and a quiet tolerance for pain. And so life unfolded, hour by hour, meal by meager meal, under conditions that would challenge even the sturdiest modern constitution. Let's drift gently over to the matter of food, or more precisely, the lack thereof. The medieval diet for most people was simple. The term luxury was reserved for salt, spices, and rare meats. Most of the time, peasants subsisted on bread, often coarse, heavy, and difficult to chew. Grains were mixed with water, sometimes fermented into a kind of porridge, and occasionally flavored with beans or cabbage. Meat was rare. Eggs might appear seasonally. Fish, if available, offered some variation, and milk, though common, was prone to souring quickly, leaving families to improvise. Famine was a familiar specter. Crop failures, bad weather, and pests could turn a normal meal into a distant memory. Children suffered most. Bodies failed to grow properly. Bones were often weak. Teeth decayed quickly under diets heavy in coarse carbohydrates. Adults, though hardened, bore the slow wear of hunger over decades. And yet, people adapted. The human form has a remarkable capacity for endurance, even when it is far from comfortable. Filth accompanied hunger as a constant presence. Streets in towns were rarely more than open gutters. Waste from homes, animals, and the occasional market stall ran freely, mingling with mud and rainwater. Flies thrived in this environment, as did rodents, who were naturally fond of sharing the same food stores humans relied upon. Washing, when it happened, was brief and infrequent. Bathing was not a daily habit, nor a weekly one for most. Water was sometimes feared as a carrier of disease, so even those who could afford baths often avoided them. Nobility, in their silks and velvets, might have seemed cleaner, but even they carried the faint smells of their own human frailty. Disease was always nearby. The term plague evokes dramatic images today, but in the Middle Ages, illness was mundane, familiar, and relentless. Lice, fleas, and worms were accepted parts of life. Skin infections, boils, and fevers arose without warning. Minor cuts could become fatal, and doctors, when consulted, offered remedies that were more ceremonial than curative: charms, herbal potions, or the occasional bloodletting. The results varied, but the intent mattered more than the outcome, a comforting thought in an uncomfortable world. Work itself was exhausting. Fields demanded long hours, from dawn to dusk, often in poor weather. Tools were rudimentary. Laborers carried heavy loads. Women bore the additional burden of childcare, domestic chores, and in some cases, tending animals or gardens. Even the strongest adult endured constant aches, bruises, and minor injuries that never fully healed. And yet, everyone persisted, quietly, without complaint, or at least without complaint that survived in the historical record. Let's drift a moment to clothing, another source of subtle misery. Fabrics were heavy, rough, and rarely changed. Peasants wore wool, sometimes layered for warmth, sometimes stiff with dirt and sweat. Linen shirts were washed occasionally, though soap was scarce. Shoes, if they existed, were basic and often poorly fitted, leading to blisters and chronic foot pain. Nobles might wear silks, velvets, and furs, which were softer and more protective, but even they experienced discomfort. Layers, pins, and elaborate hairstyles could cause headaches, back strain, or skin irritation. Beauty, it seems, has always required endurance. Sleep offered only modest relief. Beds for peasants were often straw-stuffed mats, shared with children or even animals for warmth. Nobility had softer beds, though they were sometimes infested with fleas or lice. Nighttime brought some respite, but also vulnerability. Illness, thieves, and accidents could turn sleep into a tense affair. And yet, humans slept, as they always have, seeking renewal even in less than ideal conditions. Relief came in fleeting forms. Festivals, holidays, and religious observances provided small breaks from monotony and hardship. Food might be richer. Music, dancing, and storytelling offered temporary escape. Children laughed and played despite hunger, mud, and disease. Communities formed around mutual aid, sharing what little they had. Even in hardship, there was quiet joy, a testament to resilience and adaptability. And so the medieval body was a study in endurance. It was thin, pale, and sometimes weak, yet it carried people through harsh realities. It ached, it itched, it starved, and it still persisted. Nobility might have had comfort and wealth, but they were not immune to fragility. Illness, injury, and the odd royal eccentricity tested their bodies too, though they had more attendants to witness and document their suffering. One might imagine that this constant strain hardened character, though historical accounts suggest something subtler. People learned to accept discomfort, to adapt quietly, and to find small moments of comfort wherever possible. The human form in all its vulnerability became a vessel of patience and persistence. And it is this quiet endurance, the slow, steady heartbeat of medieval survival, that we will explore further in the days to come.
We'll move next to the young, fragile bodies of royal children, whose lives were shaped as much by genetics and diet as by courtly expectations. We'll meet heirs who were sickly from birth, princes and princesses whose laughter was often brief and whose education included both privilege and relentless physical strain. But for now, let's linger a little longer in the quiet misery of ordinary medieval bodies and allow ourselves to feel the slow rhythm of survival, measured, enduring, and oddly reassuring. Because in the end, it wasn't heroism or luck that sustained medieval people, it was persistence. The body, though tested, endured. Life, though uncomfortable, went on. And perhaps lying in your warm bed tonight, we can appreciate both the fragility and resilience that our ancestors carried with quiet dignity. As we drift forward, let's leave the fields, streets, and common homes behind for a while and enter the quiet, heavily curtained chambers of royal courts. Even here, in the warmth of castles and the comfort of fine fabrics, the human body remained a fragile thing. Heirs were born with immense expectations, yet often lacked the robust constitution that those expectations demanded. Life in royalty, it seems, was never easy, even when it came with servants to fetch water, cooks to prepare meals, and doctors who insisted on bleeding you at the slightest sign of fever. Consider for a moment the children of the House of Habsburg, whose family tree is famously tangled. Incestuous marriages, meant to consolidate power and preserve bloodlines, often left heirs with curious physical conditions: a protruding jaw here, a weak spine there, a slow intellect or delicate constitution. They were meant to inherit kingdoms, yet their own bodies sometimes protested against the responsibility. Some could barely stand for hours, yet were expected to learn languages, horse riding, and diplomacy. One can almost hear the sighs of tutors balancing carefully on the fine line between instruction and survival. And then there were the Lancastrian children in England, who grew up under the watchful eyes of ambitious courtiers and nervous physicians. They ate carefully measured portions, sometimes overcooked and tasteless, to prevent indigestion, which could easily prove fatal. Exercise was regimented, though often misinformed. Some children were encouraged to walk or ride, while others were kept overly warm in fear that a chill might bring death. Doctors, armed with leeches and concoctions of dubious utility, hovered constantly. One could argue that these children learned patience not through gentle parenting, but through an endless curriculum of caution, fragility, and whispered warnings about germs, sin, and unseen maladies. Food, even in royal courts, could be both a blessing and a subtle form of torture. While nobles had access to meat, butter, cheese, and honey, their diets were often imbalanced. Spices were abundant, though they offered little nutritional value beyond flavor. Children could be given too much sugar or too little protein. Sometimes illness or simple appetite failure meant that even the best cooks could not make up for a body that refused to thrive. And yet, tutors, parents, and physicians insisted, eat or risk both spiritual and bodily decay. Let's drift gently to another curious aspect of noble childhood: fragile play and education. Children were expected to be polite, obedient, and quietly resilient. Play existed, but often with strict rules. Horses, swords, and even simple games were carefully supervised. A fall could mean more than a bruise. Infection lurked in every scrape. And yet, these children learned strategy, diplomacy, and the subtle art of enduring discomfort without complaint. Imagine a 7-year-old prince, pale-faced and exhausted, reciting Latin conjugations while nurses keep a careful eye on his weak pulse. Life demanded focus, precision, and quiet perseverance, all while the body whispered protests it could not voice. Genetics, of course, compounded the issue. Inbreeding was common, meant to preserve dynastic continuity, but the cost was often physical fragility. Elbows that bent oddly, spines that curved unnaturally, jaws that made chewing difficult. Some heirs were weak, some slow, some unusually susceptible to even minor illnesses. The irony, of course, was that these same fragile heirs were destined for immense power. They were meant to rule kingdoms with confidence, but their own bodies often whispered doubt. Yet, even in these delicate circumstances, life contained moments of quiet absurdity. Young princes were sometimes dressed in elaborate clothing that restricted movement, or forced to learn fencing while barely able to lift a sword. Tutors quarreled with cooks over diet, physicians quarreled with tutors over exercise, and parents, nervous, ambitious, or both, hovered constantly. The result was a household buzzing with gentle chaos, all aimed at producing a strong, capable heir, even when the body disagreed. Illness, as ever, was an uninvited guest. Fevers, respiratory infections, and minor injuries could all become serious threats. Some children recovered slowly, under the careful watch of physicians armed with leeches, poultices, and the occasional charm or prayer. Others did not recover at all, a quiet tragedy that was often documented with more resignation than drama. Courtiers whispered, parents fretted, and tutors adjusted their lesson plans. Life, fragile and fleeting, continued. It's worth noting, too, that these children lived lives of contrast. They were coddled and scrutinized, pampered and restricted, all in the same breath. Their fragility was a spectacle, yet also a source of anxiety for those who counted on their survival. Siblings, cousins, and distant relations watched carefully, sometimes plotting, sometimes merely observing. The human body, delicate and temperamental, was a source of fascination, frustration, and gentle consternation. And what of pleasure in these early lives? Small moments existed: a favored toy, a short ride on a pony, a rare feast of honeyed bread. Laughter was brief, play was limited, but it occurred. One can almost imagine these young heirs, pale and delicate, discovering delight in minor mischief, giggling softly while adults fretted nearby. Even in the shadow of fragility, the human impulse for joy persisted, quietly, softly, almost unnoticed. Perhaps most poignant of all was the quiet endurance that these children learned. Their bodies were weak, but their minds adapted. They learned patience, subtlety, and the art of quiet perseverance. They learned to observe, to survive, and to find small comforts amid the constant demands of instruction, propriety, and precaution. Life required careful negotiation between the body and the world it inhabited, and most managed this balance with remarkable grace, even if history remembers them only in passing notes about illness or premature death. And so, as we drift further into the medieval world, we see a continuum, from the exhausted, hunger-weary bodies of peasants to the fragile, overprotected bodies of heirs. Survival was a quiet skill, practiced by all, whether in mud-caked streets or silk-lined chambers. Bodies ached, itched, and occasionally failed, yet life persisted.
Pleasures were cherished, small victories celebrated, and endurance itself became a kind of understated nobility. Next, we will wander towards slightly older heirs and young nobles who faced additional pressures, arranged marriages, political expectations, and the peculiar habits of a court that could be as cruel as it was lavish. But for now, let us linger on the image of a sickly child, learning to endure, learning to survive, and learning, without complaint, to inhabit a world that was often uncomfortable, always demanding, and strangely beautiful in its quiet persistence. As we continue, let's leave behind the pale, fragile children for a moment and wander into the chambers of adult royalty. Here, the bodies may be stronger, but the peculiarities of court life introduce a new kind of endurance, one of patience, absurdity, and quiet bewilderment. Kings and queens, naturally, carried both the weight of their kingdoms and the quirks of their personalities, sometimes in equal measure. Consider Charles VI of France, often remembered as Charles the Mad. He spent periods entirely convinced that his body had turned into glass. Naturally, this made sitting down, standing, or even gesturing a fraught ordeal. His courtiers, for their part, learned to navigate this delicate balance, not startling him, not causing him to shatter. One imagines the soft, anxious footsteps of attendants as they moved through the halls, careful not to jostle the fragile king. It was a life of extreme caution, oddly reminiscent of the careful patience we observed in royal children, though with a heavier crown on top. Then there was Henry VIII of England, who began his reign with youthful vigor and a taste for physical activity, tournaments, and hunting, but over the years his body transformed under indulgence, injury, and illness. By the end, he was enormous, suffering from leg ulcers and chronic pain. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, his physical discomfort, he continued to govern, to command armies, and to pursue his whims with singular determination. The human body, it seems, is remarkably adaptable to both suffering and authority. We might also glance at Queen Margaret of Anjou, whose delicate health belied a fiery personality. She ruled, or attempted to, with a mixture of political cunning and relentless determination, even when her body protested. Her life reminds us that physical frailty did not always limit ambition. Sometimes it heightened the sense of drama in otherwise ordinary court politics, creating moments that would seem absurd were they not entirely real. Odd habits abound in the historical record, quietly preserved for those patient enough to notice. Some monarchs insisted on sleeping in complete darkness, accompanied by hundreds of attendants who whispered and moved like shadows around them. Others developed dietary quirks, consuming nothing but soft-boiled eggs for months, or drinking wine in precise measures while refusing water. Courtiers adapted, physicians accommodated, and life, predictably, went on. And let us not forget the small, petty rivalries that often consumed entire courts. Siblings, cousins, and advisors squabbled over trivialities, seating arrangements at banquets, the proper arrangement of flowers in a vase, or which embroidery pattern was most flattering to the king's dignity. Such disputes might seem trivial, and they were, yet they reveal a human truth. Even amidst power, wealth, and grandeur, people remain stubbornly concerned with minor comforts and perceived slights. There were, naturally, consequences to this peculiar combination of power and eccentricity. Misguided decisions, odd punishments, and strange customs often resulted. One king might demand that all tavern doors be painted a particular color, while another might decree that a rival courtier's prized horse be fed only oats laced with, well, whatever would annoy the horse most. It is easy to mock these choices now, yet they were part of a rhythm, a pattern, a slow dance of authority and human weakness that defined courtly life. Even appearances were matters of subtle endurance. Monarchs wore garments heavy with embroidery, fur, and jewels, which could weigh them down physically while signaling status. Crowns, though dazzling, pressed painfully against skulls already burdened by headaches or fevers. Shoes pinched, gloves itched, and wigs, when fashionable, could cause itching, headaches, or hair loss. A simple act, walking down a hallway, could be a small trial of patience and physical resilience. And yet, as always, the human spirit, odd, persistent, and slightly absurd, endured. Monarchs carried on with coronations, tournaments, hunting, and endless ceremonial obligations. They endured minor ailments with the stoicism of someone accustomed to discomfort. They survived fevers, falls, and the occasional assassination attempt, though not always. Life demanded adaptation, and royals, with all their peculiarities, were masters of the art. It is tempting to imagine them as distant, almost caricatured figures: the mad king, the gluttonous queen, the pious prince who couldn't lift a sword. Yet history reminds us that each eccentricity, each habit, each bodily quirk was lived in real time, with real discomfort, and often with quiet dignity. These were human bodies navigating human pressures, much like ours, though with more velvet, more gold, and more witnesses. Even the simplest acts were layered with expectation. Eating, walking, or speaking required attention to decorum, health, and perception. Bodies were tools and symbols, subject to scrutiny from family, court, and chroniclers. Physical endurance became intertwined with reputation, power, and survival. And so we see a pattern that echoes what we observed in royal children: fragility, adaptation, and the quiet persistence of life under pressure. As we drift toward the end of this section, we might reflect on the broader rhythm of medieval bodies. From the starving peasant to the delicate heir to the eccentric monarch, life was a slow negotiation with discomfort. Bodies were fragile, environments were harsh, yet humans adapted. They found comfort where they could, persisted when necessary, and endured with subtle resilience. Perhaps this is the quiet lesson of the Middle Ages, that even amidst hunger, filth, disease, and bizarre habits, life finds a way to continue, softly, persistently, and quietly remarkable. Next, we will meander into the peculiar marriages, dynastic inbreeding, and subtle tragedies that further shaped these bodies, adding new layers of endurance, fragility, and historical curiosity. But for now, let us linger on the image of the weary monarch, seated on a heavy throne, dressed in restrictive finery, balancing expectation, habit, and an achy body, yet still persisting with quiet dignity.
Now let us wander softly into the chambers of dynasties, where the unions of crowns often carried consequences far beyond politics. Royal marriages, particularly in Europe, were rarely about love. They were arrangements, contracts, and sometimes experiments in genetics, though no one at the time would have described them that way. And the human bodies involved often bore the quiet consequences, a testament to endurance and occasionally to peculiar misfortune. Consider the Habsburgs, whose bloodlines intertwined like a slow, deliberate knot. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, all in the pursuit of consolidating power and property. The results were often subtle at first, a weak jaw, slightly crooked teeth, or a delicate frame. But over generations, these small physical traits compounded. Some heirs were born with fragile constitutions, barely able to stand for long, yet expected to learn statecraft, manage armies, and represent their houses at banquets and courts. Their bodies, unfortunately, were not always equal to the task. And then there were marriages that combined eccentricity with fragility. Charles II of Spain, for example, became famous, or infamous, for his extreme physical weakness, developmental delays, and chronic illnesses. The product of generations of careful dynastic planning, his body was small, delicate, and prone to sickness. Yet he was king because royal bloodlines demanded it. Imagine the daily routine, moving carefully to avoid exhaustion, relying on attendants for even minor tasks, while advisors whispered endlessly about the kingdom's stability. Life, even in a gilded palace, was a slow negotiation with frailty. Marriage, of course, was never just about bodies, it was about heirs. And yet when both partners were physically delicate or genetically predisposed to weakness, the production of heirs could be as challenging as any battlefield. Pregnancies were risky, deliveries often fatal, and children sometimes inherited the very frailties that made their parents so interesting to historians centuries later. In a way, each royal body became a living experiment in endurance, survival, and the consequences of human design. Oddly, this did not stop monarchs from repeating the pattern. Cousins married cousins, in-laws were paired, and dynasties carefully watched each new birth, hoping that this child might combine intelligence, charisma, and a robust body, rarely a simple combination. And yet, the human body remained unpredictable. Weakness could appear suddenly, disease could strike, and sometimes, despite careful planning, an heir might be born incapable of ruling at all. History is, in part, the record of these quiet human bodily miscalculations. Even less extreme unions carried small consequences. Royal couples, instructed to produce heirs, sometimes ignored health advice, indulged in rich foods, or overexerted themselves in ceremonial duties. The human body, after all, has limits, and stress, indulgence, or poor diet could subtly weaken even the strongest prince or princess. Courtiers, physicians, and parents all played roles in this delicate dance, trying to preserve life, encourage fertility, and maintain appearances, all while the body quietly endured or failed. And yet life found ways to persist. Children were born, heirs survived, and dynasties continued. Some bodies adapted, some grew stronger, some proved unexpectedly resilient. Others, unfortunately, did not, leaving behind a record of what might be considered gentle historical tragedy: weak knees, malformed jaws, chronic illness, and the quiet endurance of a lineage that demanded more than any body could naturally provide. Even the daily rituals of these marriages highlight the subtle endurance required. Meals were carefully measured, exercise and rest prescribed, clothing regulated for comfort or display, and childbirth managed under constant scrutiny. Every gesture was performed under the expectation of health, fertility, and longevity, yet every body, being human, rebelled in small ways. Fevers, fatigue, and minor ailments reminded everyone that royalty was not immune to the natural world. Let us drift for a moment to the human side of this story. Behind the political calculations and dynastic strategies were real people quietly struggling. Queens expected to bear multiple heirs endured repeated pregnancies and miscarriages. Princes, sometimes frail from birth, were tasked with riding, training, and preparing for rule. Their lives were a delicate balance of duty, endurance, and bodily limitation. Some found comfort in hobbies, reading, or music. Others, frustrated by their frailty, developed odd habits, obsessive rituals, peculiar dietary choices, or eccentric behaviors noted with bemusement by their contemporaries. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how history records these bodies. Chroniclers, always aware of reputation and politics, noted weaknesses, strange habits, and unusual appearances, but often in gentle, understated ways. He was delicate. She suffered from frequent illness. He moved cautiously, all phrases that hint at a life of subtle endurance. And while we may view these descriptions with fascination, they are at heart accounts of human persistence in the face of biological and social expectation. Finally, as we drift toward the end of this section, it becomes clear that dynastic marriages were not only political strategies, they were ongoing experiments in human endurance. Bodies were tested, occasionally failed, and sometimes adapted in unexpected ways. Life, as always, persisted, quietly and gently through discomfort, fragility, and the peculiar demands of history. Next, we will meander into the lives of the slightly older adults, still within royal households, whose strange habits, petty feuds, and subtle eccentricities created a world that is both amusing and quietly instructive. We will see how fragile bodies, high expectations, and human absurdity intersect in the slow rhythm of medieval courts. As we wander gently further into the corridors of medieval courts, we see that power and privilege did not erase discomfort or eccentricity. In fact, they often amplified it. Courtiers, nobles, and monarchs alike carried fragile bodies, delicate egos, and the endless preoccupation with appearances. Life in these households was a subtle ballet of politeness, vigilance, and quietly suppressed annoyance, punctuated by moments of absurdity that over time became tradition. Consider the seemingly trivial disputes that occupied entire courts. Seating arrangements at banquets were contested with the gravity of treaties. Which cousin sat closest to the king? Who received the larger slice of bread? Which embroidery pattern adorned a queen's gown? In the modern world, these concerns might elicit a polite shrug. In medieval courts, they could consume hours of negotiation, argument, and whispered scheming. And yet it is this very attention
to minor details that gave structure to life, allowing people to navigate social hierarchies and maintain order in a world defined by fragility and expectation. Then there were the strange personal habits that often emerge in historical records. Some monarchs insisted on precise sleeping arrangements, attended by dozens of servants whose sole purpose was to ensure nothing disturbed their rest. Others had peculiar dietary rituals, a king who would eat nothing but boiled eggs for weeks, or a queen who refused water but consumed copious quantities of wine. Courtiers and attendants adapted, and the human body, resilient, obedient, or stubborn, endured, quietly conforming to the whims of privilege. Fleeting absurdities were everywhere. One might find a prince obsessively counting beads, a queen refusing to walk on certain stones in the palace courtyard, or siblings engaged in extended quarrels over trivial gifts or decorations. Each tiny act reveals a broader truth. Even in luxury, human beings remain preoccupied with control, comfort, and the small pleasures or irritations that make life tolerable. And when bodies are fragile or chronically uncomfortable, these small obsessions become not just quirks, but coping mechanisms. Feuds, too, could be subtle or protracted. Rivalries between cousins, siblings, and in-laws often lasted decades, fueled by minor slights and disagreements over titles, lands, or ceremonial precedents. A slight mispronunciation at a banquet could inspire weeks of quiet tension. A gift deemed inappropriate might spark months of whispered annoyance. The stakes were small yet ever-present. They required endurance, patience, strategy, and the occasional passive-aggressive display of power. Physical discomfort intertwined with these social tensions. Heavy gowns and stiff collars restricted movement, tight shoes pinched toes, and crowns weighed on already aching heads. Courtiers had to navigate these obstacles while observing proper protocol, avoiding offense, and maintaining appearances. The human body, once again, became an instrument of adaptation, quietly enduring for the sake of social survival. Even the ceremonial aspects of court life offered moments of gentle absurdity. Tournaments, hunts, and public processions combined danger, exertion, and display in equal measure. Monarchs expected grace under pressure, yet injuries, missteps, and minor accidents were common. A fall from a horse might embarrass a prince, a misaligned crown might provoke whispers, and a poorly timed cough could cause entire rooms to tense. And through it all, bodies continued to function, however awkwardly or imperfectly. It is worth noting the role of boredom, too. In periods without conflict, entertainment, or political crises, court life could be slow, repetitive, and mentally taxing. Games of chess, poetry competitions, and elaborate dinners filled the hours. Every day required patience, quiet observation, and subtle endurance. Monotony and expectation together created a unique environment, one in which small irritations were magnified, personal quirks became legendary, and the endurance of the human body remained central to survival. Despite, or perhaps because of these pressures, moments of genuine human connection appeared. Quiet conversations, shared meals, and private jokes offered small relief from formalities and discomfort. Laughter, when it occurred, was brief but cherished. Physical presence, attentiveness, and the ability to endure minor inconveniences became markers of competence and likability. And so, even amidst strict protocols, fragile bodies, and subtle rivalries, humans found ways to coexist, adapt, and persist. The slow rhythm of court life, measured, cautious, and punctuated by minor absurdities, teaches us something profound. Privilege did not exempt anyone from the limits of the human body. Wealth did not erase fatigue, discomfort, or the peculiarities of personality. And yet, these people endured, often for decades, navigating physical, social, and psychological challenges with a quiet resilience that rarely makes headlines but forms the backbone of history. As we prepare to drift toward the next section, we will explore the consequences of these lifestyles on health, longevity, and the strange mix of fragility and stubbornness that characterizes so many historical figures. We will see how diet, disease, and expectation combined to shape bodies and lives, often in ways simultaneously tragic, amusing, and deeply human. For now, let us linger on the image of a palace. Corridors echoing with soft footsteps, courtiers whispering, kings and queens adjusting gowns or crowns, and all the while, human bodies quietly enduring, persistent, delicate, and infinitely adaptable.